Welcome back to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol, straight from the front lawns of Diggy Palace. Today's session is produced in partnership with the University of Chicago. It is our pleasure to present Why Leaders Lie, John Mearsheimer in conversation with Vishnu Som. In his bold and pertinent text, Why Leaders Lie, The Truth About Lying in International Politics, political scientist John Mearsheimer breaks down the insidious and elaborate deceptions of world leaders with reasoned and constructive analysis of the logic, motivation and justification behind their lying behavior. Writing with verve, originality and precision, Mearsheimer offers a deep, path-breaking study of international politics with references to examples from the recent past. In conversation with prominent news anchor and journalist Vishnu Som, he discusses the need and effectiveness of falsehood within the political sphere. John Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Among his 6 books, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics won the Joseph Lepgold Book Prize, while the Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy made the New York Times bestseller list and has been translated into 24 languages. His latest book is The Great Delusion, Liberals, Ideals and International Realities, which won the 2019 Best Book of the Year award from the Valdai Discussion Conference, Moscow. Vishnu Som is the executive editor of NDTV, a veteran anchor with more than 8,000 hours of live broadcast experience. He anchors the flagship program Left, Right and Center at 9 p.m. on NDTV 24/7. He covers strategic affairs extensively and has produced more than 30 documentaries for the network. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section. Ladies and gentlemen, we now present Why Leaders Lie, John Mearsheimer in conversation with Vishnu Som. Over to you, Vishnu.
Well, hello and welcome to everybody. It's great to be back at the Jaipur Lit Fest. I've been a presenter and I've been a host here at JLF for quite a few occasions, and it's fascinating to have gone through John Mearsheimer's book Why Leaders Lie: The Truth About Lying in International Politics. I've covered international relations for 25 odd years, and I've never stopped to pause for a moment about an essential aspect of international relations, how nations and their leaders constantly lie to each other. And John Mearsheimer has written an entire book about that, and it's great to have him with us today. Professor Mearsheimer, when you went and you spoke to your colleagues, your friends, perhaps your family, and said, you know what, I'm going to write a book about lying and liars, how did they react?
Well, I think that everybody was fascinated by the subject for the same reason that you're fascinated by the subject. They had never read a book on international lying, on why leaders lie, right? And they knew it mattered, but they weren't sure what to make of the whole subject. So when I would go and talk, lots of people would show up for the talk, and people would love to engage me in the subject. And then after I would go home, I would receive all sorts of emails from people who were thoroughly intrigued by what I had to say. And in some cases wanted to disagree with me. And in other cases, they wanted to provide me with examples of lying that I hadn't thought of, and so forth and so on. So it was a very interesting experience.
Mr. Mearsheimer, I'm just going to quote a little bit from the start of your book, where you wrote, I can think of several reasons why the subject generates so much interest. For starters, most people consider lying to be a reprobate form of behavior, at least when you first broach the subject. Nearly everyone would recoil at being called a liar, even if they occasionally tell a lie themselves. At one level, if you're talking about international politics and you are referring to liars within the system, it is quite uncomfortable for the people you're talking about. Would you agree?
There's no question about that. But there are 2 kinds of lies that leaders tell. One are lies that they tell to other governments or to other leaders. And then there are the lies that they tell to their own people, to their own publics. Leaders understand that sometimes they have to lie to each other. And that's an acceptable form of lying in most cases. In fact, publics don't punish leaders when they lie to other leaders. But when you lie to your own people, you deceive your own people, you're really committing a sin in the eyes of most people. And most leaders recoil at the idea that they might be accused of lying to their own publics, although they sometimes do that.
I found it interesting, though, there are instances when leaders, for example, you give the example of John Kerry speaking to President Bush, and he refused to use the word liar in the context of the Iraq war. You wrote, Senator John Kerry, for example, was loath to call President Bush a liar during the 2004 presidential campaign and instead said that he failed to tell the truth about Iraq and misled the American people. At the end of the day, what George Bush did was a profound lie. He believed a series of lies and he continued to propagate that lie. It's cost tens of thousands of people their lives.
I think there's no question, as I document in the book, that the Bush administration, to include President Bush himself, told 4 major lies about the Iraq war. And I'm certain that Kerry understood that they told lies. But in the context of running for the presidency in 2004 against George W. Bush, Kerry was reluctant to use the term liar to describe Bush. And I believe that the reason he didn't use it is that it's such a strong term. It's so condemning that it probably, he thought, would have hurt him politically to accuse George W. Bush of such a sin, so to speak. So he toned down his language. But again, there's no question that Bush lied.
And then, of course, there was Trump, who uses the word liar in accusing anyone, the networks, the media, professors, journalists, whoever it is, all the time. Liar, liar, liar. I mean, that became central to the way he communicated. So that's changed, perhaps, from the time when the use of that word was something which was rare to the politics of, say, someone like Donald Trump.
Yeah, there's no question about that. This book was written in 2011 or published in 2011, and that was obvious. Donald Trump became the, and people often ask me, what do I have to say about Donald Trump? Is that, remember that to tell a lie means that you know that what you are saying is false. And I think that Donald Trump, during his presidency, made many thousands of false statements. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, were those lies? I think they were not lies because he actually believed what he was saying. I believe that Donald Trump was delusional, right? He would say things that everybody, virtually everybody, knew were not true. And they would accuse him of lying. But again, Trump actually believed what he said. So again, the word I would use to describe him is delusional, which one could argue is worse than being a liar, especially if you're the president of the United States. The second thing go ahead.
No, but how would you compare that with George Bush? Would you say that, I mean, he wasn't delusional, or perhaps certainly not in the same sense as Donald Trump, but the lies which enabled the invasion of Iraq to take place, was it a self-fulfilling prophecy which went on and on, one set of lies which went on and on, or do you believe that he actually didn't think those were lies at all?
No, I think there's a fundamental difference between the lies that Bush told and let's call them lies that Trump told. The fact is that Bush did not lie much, and therefore his lies, when he told them, were very effective because people expected him to tell the truth. And therefore it was easy for President Bush to fool the American people. because he was not someone who lied all the time. President Trump, and we're assuming here he was telling lies, he lied so often that it had no effect. Anytime President Trump said X, people would go check whether X was true or not. So his lies had very little effect. In Bush's case, his lies were strategic lies. They were used, and I'm talking more about the Bush administration than the president himself, although he participated, but it included Rumsfeld, Colin Powell, and so forth and so on. They said things that simply were not true. And this did help us, as you're alluding to, get us into the Iraq War. And in fact, what was going on here is that the Bush administration was having a very difficult time selling the war to the American people. And the only way they could sell the war and get us involved was tell a handful of lies about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, about the relationship between Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein, and then convince the American people that we should actually fight this unnecessary war. And of course, what happened was they succeeded in making the case to the American people that a war was justified, but it was based in good part on a series of lies. We have no analogous case with Trump. Trump was just lying all the time, or he was delusional all the time, and his lies had no effect because people recognized them as lies and went about their business.
Professor Mearsheimer, you've mentioned, and again, a quote from what you've written, international lying, in other words, is misconduct. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I think that lying sometimes makes good sense. I mean, it was one of the main points that I tried to make in the book. If we look at what President George Bush and his administration did in the run-up to the Iraq War, obviously that backfired. That did consequences. But I could point out to you a number of cases where leaders have lied and it's worked to their advantage. And I think the best case is John F. Kennedy's lies during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The crisis was evolving, it settled, and that the Soviets were going to take their missiles out of Cuba. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, told John F. Kennedy, obviously the American president, that the Americans had to take the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey, the equivalent missiles to the missiles that the Soviets were putting in Cuba. Now, Kennedy had the Pentagon to take the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey when he became president. So Kennedy was there to begin with. But the problem was that if it became public knowledge that he had taken the Jupiter Soviets, it not hurt him domestically. And he 1964 election that was coming up, but furthermore, hurt him with our European allies, because remember, Turkey was a part of NATO, or Turkey is a part of NATO. So what Kennedy told Khrushchev was, listen, I'm going to take the Jupiters out of Turkey. We have a deal. But you have to understand that I'm going to have to deny that I'm taking the Jupiter missiles out of Turkey. I'm in effect going to have to lie to the American people and to my allies, because I can't, for political reasons and strategic reasons, tell the truth. So when you hear me saying I'm not taking the Jupiter missiles out, you should understand that I am taking the Jupiter missiles out. Anyway, Kennedy was willing to lie to the American people and to our European allies. And he did it for good strategic reasons. This was not a selfish lie. Kennedy was not doing this for self-serving purposes. He was doing it for the good of the country. And actually, one could argue the good of the world, because we, in the end, avoided a war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's an example of a strategic lie that made good sense. And I could point to all sorts of other examples where leaders, tell lies for good reasons.
What about populations which believe their leaders and cannot imagine that their leaders would lie? For example, over here in India, we have a very strong leadership which is believed. And we've got a situation, for example, with China. And there is a certain rhetoric which goes top down, which most people, I would argue, would tend to believe. There are others who would say that that's not true at all. So is it true, perhaps, that lying works more effectively depending on the domestic base you have and what they're willing to accept and what they're not willing to accept?
Yes. I think that possibly the most controversial argument in my book is that leaders lie more to their own people than they lie to each other. The reason leaders don't lie that much to each other is that leaders don't trust other leaders to begin with. The Indian leader is not going to trust the Chinese leader. The Chinese leader is not only not going to trust the Indian leader, he's not going to trust the American leader. Leaders, don't trust each other very much. Therefore, it's hard to deploy an effective lie. When you talk about publics tend to trust their leaders because they think their leaders have their welfare at heart. They're looking out for them. So it's hardly surprising that the Indian public, by and large, believes an Indian leader when he or she says that we have to do this for that reason or this reason, right? That makes it easier for leaders to lie to their own people than to lie to other leaders. And if I could just tell you one quick story that illustrates this. During the run-up to the Iraq War in 2003, I went to MIT to listen to a talk, and a man who knew a lot about Iraqi WMD convinced me that Iraq had no weapons of mass destruction, WMD. So I started telling people that. Then Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld said that we know that Iraq has WMD, and indeed we know where those WMD are located. And Colin Powell said effectively the same thing. Well, I believed them. I said to myself, the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State are not going to lie to the American people. So I changed my story and I stopped. Didn't think that Iraq had WMD. Now, what was going on there? Basically, I was being a good citizen and trusting my leaders. And therefore, it was easy for them to bamboozle me and convince me that Saddam actually did have WMD.
Yeah.
Logic that's at play when leaders deal with their publics.
Yeah. You used the phrase deployment of a lie a few minutes back. Would you say that in the present context, the deployment of a lie, either for international gains or gains from a leadership to a domestic constituency, is much easier than it was even 10 years back because of Twitter, because of social media, and because of bots who just repeat a message irrespective of whether it's the truth or a lie?
I actually think it's much harder to tell a lie today for two reasons. One is people are much more cynical today than they were 10 or 15 years ago. I think that the reason I believed Donald Rumsfeld when he said that Saddam had WMD is that I grew up in America in the 1950s and the 1960s when people tended to be less cynical than they are today. And I think that's true worldwide. The second point I would make is that with Twitter, with Wikipedia, with the internet more generally, anytime you say something, a couple thousand people go out and check what you said to see whether it's correct or not. And then if they find that you're not telling the truth, they spread that word around the planet, the entire planet, almost instantaneously. So if you tell a bold-faced lie at this point in time, it's very hard to get away with it. So I think lying is more difficult both to publics and to other leaders today than it was, let's say, 30, 40, 50 years ago, certainly when I was younger.
Yeah. Professor, I tend to disagree with you slightly on that. I personally believe that in a country like India, which has an incredible presence on Twitter, one of the largest, if not the largest Twitter presence on earth, certainly one of the largest, if there is a message which we can fact check and prove to be incorrect being made by the government, it doesn't really matter because they put it out on social media and certainly on Twitter, and they've got their Twitter armies. You'd have 10,000 likes and 10,000 follows and several thousand comments. And therefore, when you send that out and people see that and read that, even if they're cynical and tend to believe that they have a right to question, they would perhaps read a dozen accounts, all of whom say, no, that's right, that's absolutely true, and tend to believe that. In my experience on Twitter, that's an unfortunate reality that Twitter bots, as directed and dictated insidiously by governments, tend to control the narrative. And people often tend to believe that. And that's my personal view. I mean, would you like to add to that?
No, I see what you're saying. I hadn't thought of it from that perspective, but that makes eminently good sense. So that would be an argument that cuts in the other direction from what I'm saying.
Professor, let's move on to a couple of other points that you have written. Again, quoting from your book, lying is obviously a form of deception, but not all deception is lying. There are two other kinds of deception, concealment and spinning. Let's talk about that. Lying is a form of deception, but not all deception is lying. Why don't you start with that?
Well, I distinguish between two broad categories.
Yeah.
Deception on one hand and truth-telling on the other. Deception and truth-telling. Truth-telling is where if you ask me a question, I go to great lengths to tell you everything in as straightforward a way as possible about the question you're asking. That's truth-telling. Deception can take three forms. So let's say that I try to deceive you. One is I can lie to you. That is where I say something that I know is not true. Second, I can conceal something from you. It could be that I had been arrested 10 years ago and put in jail. And you're asking me a question about my past behavior, and I just conceal the fact that I was in jail. That's different than lying. If you asked me, John, were you in jail ever in your life? And I said, no, that would be a lie. But if I just don't raise the subject, I'm concealing the issue. Spinning is something that we do all the time in our daily life. Spinning is where we don't tell a lie, but we construct the story in a way that is the most favorable to us. If you're interviewing me for a job and I come to your office and you ask me all sorts of questions about my past experiences, I'm going to spin the stories about my life in the most positive way. I'm going to arrange the facts in a way that will make me look good to you so that you will hire me. But it is, if you think about it, a form of deception. And that's why if you were interviewing me, you would go to great lengths to ask me difficult questions. You would be looking for the holes in my armor because you know I have an interest for purposes of getting the job to deceive you. We don't talk about it in those terms, but you would not expect somebody to come in and tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, because that person probably wouldn't get the job then.
What about the entire issue of belief? What if you believe that a person isn't lying and you aren't willing to consider the facts of the case?
Well, the truth is, when you talk about nationalism, whether you're talking about Indian nationalism, American nationalism, almost everybody who writes about nationalism knows that nationalism is based on myths. Indians and Americans, Israelis, Egyptians, you name it, all these peoples tell themselves stories about their past that are not true. They're myths, but they fervently believe those myths. And therefore, when they repeat the myths, one is tempted to say they're lying, but they're really not lying because they believe what they say, right? Again, this gets back to the point I made regarding Donald Trump. You have to believe that you're telling something that's false for it to be a lie. And nationalism, the stories that surround the founding of any country are just filled with myths where let's just take India. India is always in the right. The other is always in the wrong. Talk about the United States. The United States is always in the right. The British in the beginning were always wrong, right? And of course, if you go back and look at the historical record, it's a much more complicated question. And you quickly discover that there are all these myths out there. And by the way, this is why professional historians in the academic world are so dangerous for countries, because historians are interested in telling the truth. Historians are interested in undermining myths, but nationalism requires myths, and nationalism is the most powerful political ideology on the planet. And although at first glance, it looks like nationalism is all about lies, it really isn't in a technical sense because people believe those myths.
Would you say that the myth or the lie about how America perceives Russia has changed to a great extent and has been replaced by China?
Well, one would think that today the United States would be focusing on China as the great threat, and it would be working to repair its relations with Russia so that Russia and the United States would be allied against China. If you think about the period before World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union were at first adversaries. But once the Soviet Union went to war against Nazi Germany, the United States and the Soviet Union became allies against Nazi Germany. It was imperative for the United States to have the Soviet Union as an ally against Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
Well, today, given what a powerful country China is and what a serious threat it represents to the United States, you would expect the United States to be allied with Russia against China. But that's not the case.
No.
And in many quarters in the United States, Russia is seen as a greater threat than China. And this, in good part, revolves around the belief that the Russians interfered in the 2016 election and they're responsible for Hillary Clinton's defeat. I believe that there is hardly any evidence to support that. I believe that Russophobia in the United States is completely out of control.
Yeah.
And I believe that it's based on myths. The truth is that Hillary Clinton and her supporters do believe that the Russians are responsible for her defeat, even though that's not true. So you cannot accuse them of lying. What's going on here is you have delusional thinking. The Russophobia in the United States is delusional. And we therefore are in this bizarre situation where we're paying all of this attention to Russia, which is not a very powerful state, is a declining great power. And at the same time, that's preventing us from working with the Russians to contain the Chinese. And the Chinese, or China, is a serious threat, not just to the United States, but to India as well.
Yeah, absolutely. What threat do the biggest whistleblowers, people like Julian Assange, for example, represent to a system of international lying among great powers or countries?
Well, someone like Julian Assange makes it much more difficult for leaders to conceal what they're doing and to lie. You want to remember, I said there were three forms of deception: spinning, concealment, and lying. And concealment, although we're not focusing on that in our discussion, we're talking about lying. Concealment is very important. Countries
Let's
go to
talk about that.
conceal what they're doing. And what someone like Julian Assange is doing is revealing to the world what the United States is up to. And the same thing was true with what's his name, Snowden.
Snowden, Edward Snowden, yeah.
Snowden, yeah, right. Snowden was revealing secrets that the United States wanted to keep secret. And so these guys are real threats. And of course, the state, the U.S. government has gone to great lengths to silence them and to punish them for deterrent purposes.
Professor, and yet you have in the United States a wonderful system of declassifying files. I have, for example, read a lot about how Richard Nixon used to think about Indira Gandhi. And on the face of it, the relationship was polite and kind, but in real terms, he hated her guts, and he was rough and rude about how he spoke about her, which is understandable. It was said in confidence. In America, you have this wonderful system of telling the truth eventually.
Yes. Well, I think there's a widespread belief that in a democracy, it's important that over time, the private papers, the official papers of governments and leaders be made available to the broader public, and especially to historians and scholars, and biographers and so forth and so on, because it's important that we know what happened in the past so we can figure out how to understand our history, number one, and also we can operate more effectively in the present and in the future because we understand what happened in the past. So there's this widespread belief that ultimately you want to get all the facts out and then let people make sense of the facts. And the United States has been very effective in that regard. And I think it's all for the good. Now, the case of Richard Nixon, he taped his conversations. So we now know all sorts of things about how he viewed other people. Indira Gandhi probably wasn't one of his worst enemies. I mean, he probably had worse things to say about all sorts of other people that, was recorded in the Oval Office and is now publicly available.
Yeah. Statesmen and diplomats are rarely punished for lying, especially if they are telling lies to other countries. This is a system that protects its liars.
Well, if a leader lies to another country and that becomes public knowledge, that leader is highly unlikely to be punished by his or her own people, because the public expects its leaders to tell lies to other leaders. That's what international politics is all about. Everybody understands international politics is a nasty and brutish business. And sometimes your leaders have to do harsh things or take harsh measures or lie. This is just important to do to protect everybody who lives in a particular society. So the public will forgive interstate lying. As I said earlier, it's when leaders lie to their own people that they get into trouble. And let me embellish that a bit more. I believe if a leader lies to his or her own public, but the subsequent policy is successful, then the lies won't matter. It's when the subsequent policy fails that people revisit the decision to go to war, they see the lies, and they punish the leader. Now, the two prominent cases of this are the Vietnam War. We now know that President Johnson and his lieutenants told a series of lies about the infamous Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Yep.
So that President Johnson could get basically carte blanche to take any military action he saw fit against North Vietnam. Now, what happened after the Gulf of Tonkin resolution is that the war in Vietnam ramped up. And by 1968, it was clear that the war was a disaster. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was 64, August 1964. August 1968, it's perfectly clear that the United States is in a losing war and suffering huge casualties. So people revisit the decision-making process. They see the lies, and the end result is that Johnson gets punished severely. This is the same thing that happens to George W. Bush with the Iraq War. He thought the Iraq War would be a great success. We'd have a victory parade down Broadway. Everybody would be cheering him as a strategic genius, and so forth and so on. And then nobody would pay attention to the lies. If the war had turned out that way, I think he would have been correct. But what happened is the war went south. The war in Iraq turned into a disaster. So people then revisited the decision-making process to ask the question, how did we end up in this mess? And then what they saw was that Bush, Rumsfeld, Powell, and so forth and so on did not tell the truth, and indeed concealed important information from the American public. And he paid a real price. And by the way, Tony Blair paid an even greater price in Britain. Very important. Again,
yes, that's true.
Blair faced greater resistance in Britain than Bush did in the United States. And I believe Blair told even more lies in Britain than Bush did in the United States. And the end result is that Tony Blair, because of the Iraq War, destroyed his reputation.
Yeah. One final question, we're running short on time. Are strategic cover-ups lies? When you say a strategic cover-up, is it the same as saying a lie?
Yes, yes. By the way, the example that I gave before of President Kennedy lying about removing the Jupiter missiles from Turkey during the Cuban Missile Crisis was a strategic cover-up. Another good example of a strategic cover-up has to do with Marshal Joffre, who was the commanding general of the French armies fighting against Germany in 1916 on the Western Front. Marshal Joffre was incompetent. Marshal Joffre was the last general you would want in charge of your soldiers if you were fighting against a formidable army like the Imperial German Army. And he happened to be in command in 1916 when the famous Battle of Verdun took place in France. The problem that the French political and military leadership faced was that they could not say that Joffre was incompetent and immediately remove him from command. They instead had to lie about Joffre and say that Joffre was a brilliant general. And they had to do that for two reasons. One, they couldn't tell the generals on the German side that they were fighting against an idiot general, Joffre, and they couldn't tell the French public that their husbands and their children who were dying in the Battle of Verdun were being led by a foolish general. They had to say that Joffre was a brilliant general, and then eventually got rid of him. So this was a strategic cover-up. It was a lie, but it was done for good purposes. The French leadership was trying to keep the French army intact and keep the Germans at bay. And they felt that to do that, they effectively had to lie about Joffre.
Yeah. Well, it's been wonderful speaking to you, Professor Mearsheimer. And I think as we wrap this session up, you wrote something which it sort of summarizes what we've been talking about. And you wrote, nationalist myth-making is when leaders tell lies mainly to their own people about their country's past. In essence, they tell a story in which we are always right and they are always wrong. So it is essentially part of a system which revolves around the world, certainly affects our democracies in so many forms. It's been wonderful speaking to you. Thank you very much for being part of JLF this year.
My pleasure, Vishnu, and thank you for interviewing me.
Thank you, John and Vishnu, for that thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much. We'd like to thank the University of Chicago for supporting this session and to our celebration partners Diageo for their constant support. Thank you all for watching, and do remember to pick up your copy of the book from our Amazon bookstore. Please do stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that we have specially curated for you. And as you are aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic. And while we have braced ourselves to embrace this new normal, we have struggled to ensure that we bring to you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We would love your support towards Teamwork Arts. Any contribution is welcome. Do also remember to tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 and tag us at Jaipur Lit Fest. The festival is protected by Dettol. We do hope to see you in other sessions.